March 17, 1903, St. Patrick's Day. The cramped tenements of 5 Points, Manhattan, swelter under an unseasonable heat wave. Inside a third-floor walk-up on Mulberry Street, Father Timothy O'Malley kneels beside a crude pine coffin, preparing to administer last rites to what he believes is the CBR corpse of Brigid McGowan, a 42-year-old Irish widow. That's when he hears it. A sound, faint, rhythmic, coming from inside the sealed casket. The priest's hands freeze over his rosary beads. The sound grows clearer. It's singing. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, warbling an old Gaelic tune. He mourners gathered in the stifling room fall silent, their faces draining of colour. Brigid's adult son, Patrick, stands frozen in the corner, his eyes wide with what the priest would later describe as not surprise but terrible recognition. Father O'Malley demands the coffin be opened immediate bare lie. What they found inside that box would expose a pattern of death that had haunted the Irish immigrant community for nearly 18 months. A pattern so disturbing that the New York Police Department would eventually suspect Brigid McGowan of being responsible for the deaths of at least 7 people, perhaps more. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Irish widow who may have buried her victims alive, make sure to subscribe to The Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's step back to the turn of the century, to a time when New York's immigrant neighborhoods held secrets that would make even the most hardened detective question everything they thought they knew about human nature. The New York City of 1903 bore little resemblance to the gleaming metropolis we know today. In the densely packed neighborhood of 5 Points, once considered the most dangerous slum in America, Irish immigrants crowded into tenements where entire families shared single rooms. The neighborhood had improved somewhat from its darkest days of the 1850s, but poverty, disease, and desperation still clung to its narrow streets like the coal smoke that perpetually hazed the air. This was the era of Tammany Hall's iron grip on city politics, when DBR Democratic ward bosses controlled everything from job opportunities to police protection. Immigrant communities, particularly the Irish, maintained fierce internal loyalty. What happened within the tenement walls stayed within those walls. The police, many of them Irish themselves, understood this unwritten code. Some problems, the thinking went, were best handled by the community itself. Brigid McGowan had arrived in New York from County Cork in 1881, part of the massive wave of Irish immigration fleeing poverty and British oppression. By all accounts, she had been a devoted wife to her husband, Thomas, a longshoreman who worked the brutal shifts along the East River docks. They had 3 children who survived infancy, a remarkable feat in itself, given that infant mortality in 5 Points exceeded 40%. Thomas died in 1898, crushed between a ship's hull and the dock during an accident that witnesses described as unavoidable. Brigid received no compensation. She found herself alone with 3 children, Patrick, 20, Mary, 16, and young Thomas Jr., just 12, in a city that offered widows few options beyond domestic service or factory work. But Brigid McGowan was resourceful. She began taking in boarders, first 1, then 2, then eventually as many as 5 at a time in her cramped 4-room apartment. The neighbors noted her peculiar kindness toward the elderly and infirm. She seemed to attract the most vulnerable, widowers with no family, elderly immigrants with no English, the chronically ill who had nowhere else to turn. She had a gift for finding the lost souls, Father O'Malley would later tell investigators, the ones nobody else wanted to care for. The priest had considered this Christian charity. He had praised Brigid from the pulpit, holding her up as an example of Irish Catholic virtue, a widow sharing her meager resources with those even less fortunate than herself. What he didn't know was that Brigid's boarders had a disturbing tendency to die. The first death occurred in November 1901. Seamus Flannery, a 73-year-old Barker Ealer who had worked as a rag picker, took ill with what Brigid described as the consumption. He had been boarding with her for only 6 weeks. The neighborhood doctor, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Strauss who served the tenement population, examined Flannery twice. Both times he found symptoms consistent with tuberculosis, the white plague that ravaged the crowded tenements. Flannery died on a Tuesday morning. Brigid found him in his bed, she said, peaceful and cold. Dr. Strauss signed the death certificate without hesitation. Tuberculosis claimed hundreds of lives in 5 points every YBR year. This was merely one more. What made the neighbors whisper, though, was how quickly Brigid had Flannery buried. Within 24 hours of his death, his body was in the ground at Calvary Cemetery in Queens. "Before the body's even cold," muttered Catherine O'Shea, who lived 1 floor below. BBR to whispers remained only whispers. Brigid had paid for the funeral herself, a generous act that seemed to prove her good character. The second death came in March 1902. Margaret Donnelly, a widow of 68 who had no living relatives in America, had been boarding with Brigid for 4 months. Speary complained of stomach troubles, violent pains, vomiting, episodes of delirium. Dr. Strauss attributed it to food poisoning, perhaps bad oysters from one of the street vendors. He prescribed bed rest and bland foods. Margaret died 3 weeks later, her body wasted to skeletal purport. Ions. Again, DRBR. Strauss signed the death certificate. Cause of death, gastric fever. Again, Brigid arranged for a swift burial, this time paying for a modest headstone. She wept openly at the funeral, supported by her son Patrick, who had grown to a large, silent young man who worked as a butcher's assistant. "The poor lamb had nobody," Brigid told the other mourners, dabbing at her eyes with a black handkerchief. "I'm only glad I could give her comfort in her final days." The third death raised more eyebrows. James Byrne was only 52 years old and had seemed in reasonable health when he moved into BR Brigid's apartment in July 1902. A former railway worker disabled by a back injury, Byrne had a small pension that he used to pay his board. He was known to enjoy his drink but was generally considered a quiet, harmless soul. In September, Byrne began experiencing what he described to neighbors as dizzy spells. He complained of numbness in his hands and feet. His speech became slurred. Dr. Strauss, making his rounds, suspected the effects of chronic alcoholism, not uncommon among the Irish immigrant population. He warned Byrne to reduce his drinking. The dizzy spells grew worse. Byrne told the butcher where Patrick worked that he sometimes felt like he was floating away from his own body. He described episodes where he couldn't move his limbs, though his mind remained conscious. The butcher, a practical man named Goldstein, suggested Byrne should perhaps see a specialist at Belvoubury Hospital. Byrne died in his sleep on October 3, 1902. Dr. Strauss, by now familiar with the pattern of deaths in Brigid's apartment, examined the body more carefully this time. He noted the unusual paleness of Byrne's skin, the peculiar rigidity of the limbs, but without evidence of violence and with Byrne's history of alcoholism, he certified the death as resulting from apoplexy, a stroke. This time, however, Byrne's cousin arrived from Boston for the funeral. Michael Byrne was a police sergeant in that city, and he had questions. Why had James deteriorated so rapidly? Why had no one sent word that his condition was so serious? Why was the funeral being rushed through in barely 36 hours? Brigid had answers for everything. James had been adamant about not wanting to worry his Boston relations. The quick funeral was simply practical. It was October, and in the tenements, bodies couldn't be kept long. As for the rapid decline, well, sometimes the Lord called his children home when their time had come. Michael Byrne left New York dissatisfied, but with no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. He wrote a letter to the New York Police Department expressing his concerns. The letter WBR is filed away and forgotten. Beat cops didn't investigate natural deaths in the tenements. They barely investigated the murders. The fourth death finally prompted Father O'Malley to pay closer attention. Nora Cassidy was only 39 years old, a woman close to Brigid's owl. She had been recovering from pneumonia when she came to board with Brigid in December 1902, sent there by her own family who could no longer afford to care for her. while also working the long factory hours that kept them fed. Nora had been improving. Her sister Kathleen visited every Sunday and saw the progress with her own eyes. Color returning to Nora's cheeks, appetite returning, the terrible cough that had plagued her growing quieter. Then, in late January 1903, Nora took a turn. She complained of the same symptoms James Byrne had described: numbness, dizziness, a terrifying sensation of paralysis that CBR, AMA, and went. She told her sister she sometimes felt like she was disappearing, that she could hear and see but couldn't make her body respond. "It's like being buried alive in my own skin," Nora whispered during their last visit. Kathleen wanted to move Nora to the charity hospital. Brigid insisted that the stress of moving would be too much for her fragile system. Dr. Strauss, worn down by too many patients and too little time, agreed. Nora remained in Brigid's care. She died on February 14, 1903, Valentine's Day. This time, Kathleen Cassidy refused to accept Dr. Strauss's explanation of heart failure. She went directly to Father O'Malley and demanded that he intervene. 5 deaths in less than 18 months in one apartment. Surely this wasn't normal, even in 5 Points where death was commonplace. Father O'Malley promised to look into the matter. He visited Brigid's apartment and, speaking with her and her son Patrick, he found Brigid to be a model of piety and devotion. Her apartment was spotlessly clean, her devotion to her boarders seemingly genuine. Patrick was quiet but respectful, dedicated to supporting his mother's charitable work. The priest left reassured. He gently told Kathleen Cassidy that sometimes God called the sick and suffering home, and it was not for them to question his divine plan. Kathleen Cassidy didn't accept this answer. She began asking questions throughout the neighborhood, comparing notes with others who had lost relatives in Brigid McGowan's care. A pattern emerged that chilled her blood. The symptoms were always similar in the final weeks: numbness, paralysis, the terrifying sensation of being trapped in one's own body. The deaths always came suddenly, just when the person seemed to be improving or stabilizing. And the burials always happened with suspicious speed. But it was an old Italian woman, Maria Rossetti, who gave Kathleen the detail that would eventually break the case wide open. Maria lived next door to Brigid and shared a thin wall with her apartment. In broken English, she told Kathleen about the sounds she sometimes heard late at night, low moaning, as if from someone unable to cry out. And once, she swore, she had heard what sounded like scratching, desperate, frantic scratching coming from inside Brigid's apartment in the hours before James Byrne's funeral. "Like fingernail." "On wood," Maria whispered. CRBR ossing herself. "Madonna mia, like someone in a box." If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The investigation that's about to unfold would expose one of the most disturbing patterns of death in New York City history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries, because what happens next will challenge everything we think we know about the line between life and death. Let's discover what happens next. March 17, 1903. St. Patrick's Day dawned. "Open this coffin immediately." Brigid found her voice. "Father, please, this is a trick of the heat, the wood expanding. Open it." 2 men in the crowd stepped forward and began prying at the lid. The nails screeched as they came loose. The singing inside grew more frantic, words dissolving into wordless keening. The lid came off. Abba Sullivan lay inside, her arms crossed over her chest in the traditional pose of death, but her eyes were open. They rolled wildly, unable to focus. Her mouth moved, producing the eerie song, but her body remained rigid, immobile. Only her eyes and mouth were moving. She was paralyzed but conscious, and she had been sealed in that coffin for nearly 2 days. The room erupted into chaos. Women screamed, men shouted. Father O'Malley lifted Anna from the coffin with help from others. Her body was rigid, her limbs locked in position, but she was breathing. Her eyes pleaded silently, tears running down her temples into her gray hair. "Get Dr. Strauss!" the priest shouted. "And someone fetch the police!" He turned to confront Brigid, but she was already moving. With surprising speed for a woman who had claimed to be on her deathbed, she bolted for the door. Patrick moved to follow her. Bubba T. 3 men from the crowd tackled him. He was strong, but not strong enough to fight off 3 dock workers. Brigid made it to the stairwell before Father O'Malley caught her arm. She turned on him with a fury that transformed her face into something he would later describe as demonic. "They were meant to die," she hissed. "They wanted to die. I gave them peace." "You buried them alive," the priest said, his voice shaking. "How many, Brigid? How many did you bury alive?" She smiled, then a terrible, serene smile. "Not enough. Never enough. Do you know what they paid me? Everything, ever Bawai last cent, and they died grateful." Within an hour, the apartment at Mulberry Street was swarming with police officers. Detective Sergeant William Murphy of the 4th Precinct, one of the few Irish cops who had risen to detective rank, took charge of the scene. What he found in Brigid's apartment would haunt him for the rest of his career. In a trunk beneath Brigid's bed, officers found documents, wills, hastily signed and witnessed by Patrick, leaving the estates of 5 different boarders to Brigid McGowan. They found bank books showing deposits made within days of each death. They found BBR bottles of chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. And they found a journal. The journal was the most damning evidence. In Brigid's own hand, written in a mixture of English and Gaelic, she had documented each patient, as she called them. She described dosing TBR hem with chloral hydrate mixed into their evening tea or soup, slowly over weeks, watching as they developed the paralytic symptoms. She wrote about the perfect dose enough to induce a death-like paralysis that could fool even a cursory medical examination, but not so much that the heart would Akbar-Uli stop. She had been burying people alive deliberately, waiting for them to suffocate in their coffins, after ensuring their wills named her as beneficiary. "They sleep so peaceful," she had written about James Byrne. "No struggle, just the slow dark, like going home to God. And they gave me Eve Bar, everything freely. This is fair." The most chilling entry was about Nora Cassidy. N.C. fought the longest, could hear her in the box the night before burial, singing hymns. P had to sit on the lid while I prayed for her soul. The Lord took her before morning. All is well. Dr. Strauss, when questioned, admitted he had grown suspicious but had lacked the evidence or courage to challenge Brigid directly. In the tenements, doctors saw so much death that the line between natural and unnatural often blurred. He had failed these people, he confessed, and the guilt would drive him to hang himself 6 months later. Anna Sullivan survived, though she would never fully recover. The chloral hydrate had caused permanent neurological damage. She could speak haltingly, but would never walk again. She described the horror of being conscious, but unable to move or cry out, as Brigid and Patrick sealed her in the coffin. She had heard the nails being hammered in. She had felt the coffin being carried, and then the darkness, the airless dark, and the terrible realization that no one would open the box until she was truly dead. Investigation aftermath. The arrest of Brigid McGowan and her son Patriba C.K. on March 17, 1903, sent shockwaves through New York's Irish community and beyond. This wasn't a crime of passion or poverty-driven desperation. This was calculated, systematic murder motivated by greed and carried out with a cruelty that defied comprehension. Detective Sergeant Murphy's investigation expanded rapidly. He immediately ordered exhumations of all 7 known victims who had died in Brigid's care. What forensic science existed in 1903 was primitive by modern standards, but the evidence that emerged from those graves was undeniable. The exhumations began on March 20th at Calvary Cemetery. The first coffin opened was that of James Byrne, buried 6 months earlier. When the gravediggers lifted the lid, witnesses recoiled in horror. Byrne's body, partially decomposed but still recognizable, lay in a twisted position. His hands, reduced to skeletal remains with fragments of scibar N, were raised above his head. The inside of the coffin lid bore deep scratch marks, gouges in the wood, made by fingernails. Splinters were found embedded in the bone of his finger joints. James Byrne had woken up in his coffin. He had been conscious enough to know where he was, and he had died trying to claw his way out. Margaret Donnelly's grave told the same story. Her body had turned completely over in the coffin, facing downward. One of her arms had broken through the coffin's thin bottom, the hand extended into the earth below as I. She had tried to dig herself out. The coroner conducting the examination found soil under what remained of her fingernails. Seamus Flannery's coffin revealed something even more disturbing. His mouth was open in what the coroner described as a silent scream, and lodged in his throat were wood splinters suggesting he had bitten at the coffin lid in his final moments of suffocating terror. Nora Cassidy's exhumation was attended by her sister Kathleen, who insisted on being present despite warnings about the condition of the body. Kathleen identified her sister's body and noticed something the male investigators had missed. Nora's fingers, what remained of them, were worn down to the bone on the tips. She had scratched so desperately, for so long, that she had destroyed her own fingers against the wood. "She was so strong," Kathleen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She fought so hard to live." Not all the victims showed signs of Wabber King. Anna Sullivan's testimony suggested that Brigid had refined her dosing over time, learning from early mistakes where victims regained consciousness too soon. Seamus Flannery, the first victim, had likely been underdosed, explaining the violent evidence of his awakening. By the time she got to Anna Sullivan, Brigid had become more confident, perhaps too confident, which led to her timing off enough for Father O'Malley to discover the truth. The forensic physicians, led by Dr. Otto Schulze, the city's deputy coroner, concluded that at least 4 of the 7 victims had been buried à libre vie and conscious. The others had either suffocated while still paralyzed or had died from the effects of the chloral hydrate before awakening. Either way, Brigid McGowan was responsible for their deaths. The political ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. The scandal exposed massive failures in the city's medical certification system. Dr. Strauss had signed death certificates without performing thorough examinations, trusting the word of a murderer. The coroner's office had rubber-stamped burial permits without investigation, and the police had ignored warnings from concerned relative because deaths in the tenements were too common to warrant scrutiny. Tammany Hall, ever sensitive to Irish Catholic opinion, initially tried to distance itself from the case. But as the evidence mounted and public outrage grew, even the political machine had to acknowledge that this went beyond acceptable corruption. The Chief Medical Examiner's Office was reformed, with new requirements for death certification implemented by July 1903. Doctors could no longer sign death certificates without physical examination of the body. Families were given more time before burial to ensure death was genuine, and most significantly, any death of a person living in a rooming house or boarding situation had to be reported to the police. The trial of Brigid McGowan began on September 14, 1903, in the Criminal Courts Building. It would become one of the most sensational trials in New York history. DRB bar awing overflow crowds who queued for hours hoping to get a seat in the courtroom. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney William Travers Jerome, presented a devastating case. He walked the jury through the timeline of deaths, the physical evidence from the exhumations, the journal entry in Brigid's own hand, and the testimony of Anna Sullivan, who appeared in court in a wheelchair, still bearing the marks of her ordeal. Anna's testimony was particularly powerful. Speaking in a halting voice, she described her last evening before being sealed in the coffin. Brigid had given her TBREA, telling her it would help her sleep. Anna remembered feeling strange, disconnected from her body. She tried to call out, but her voice wouldn't work. She felt herself being prepared for burial, her body washed, dressed, positioned in the coffin. She was screaming inside her own head, but no sound came out. "I heard them hammering," Anna testified, her voice breaking. "Every nail, I counted them, 16 nails to seal a coffin. I heard every single one." When asked about what she thought while sealed inside, Anna was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I prayed for death. I prayed Thaberty God would take me quickly before I ran out of air." but he wanted me to live. He wanted me to tell what she did. The defense, appointed by the court because Brigid couldn't afford counsel, attempted to paint her as a woman driven to desperation by poverty and grief. Her attorney, a young Irish LBR lawyer named Sean O'Brien, who had taken the case reluctantly, argued that Brigid had indeed cared for these people, that any hastening of death was a misguided mercy, not murder. He suggested that Brigid had learned the chloral hydrate technique from a doctor and believed she was easing suffering, no but he causing it. This argument collapsed under cross-examination. When confronted with the journal entries describing her financial calculations, the wills she had manipulated her victims into signing, and the clear evidence that she knew her victims were waking up in their coffins, O'Brien had no effective response. Patrick McGowan's defense was equally weak. While he hadn't administered the poison, he had been fully complicit. He had helped seal the coffins, had forged witnesses' signatures on wills, and had physically restrained Anna Sullivan's coffin when his mother heard signs of life inside her. His silence, his strength, his willingness to help his mother commit these atrocities made him equally guilty in the eyes of the law. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Brigid herself took the stand against her lawyer's advice. Dressed entirely in black, clutching a rosary, she presented herself as a devout Catholic widow who had only tried to help the less fortunate. But under cross-examination, her mask slipped. When Jerome pressed her about the scratch marks found in the coffins, about the evidence that her victims had woken up and suffered, Brigid's response shocked the Corbett room into silence. "They were dying anyway," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "All I did was speed them on their way, and they paid me for my troubles. That's fair, isn't it? They had no one else, no family, no future. I gave them purpose. They died supporting a poor widow and her children. That's more meaning than their miserable lives ever had." Jerome seized on this. "So you admit you knew they might wake up, that they might suffer?" Brigid smiled, that same terrible smile Father O'Malley had seen. "We all suffer in this world, Mr. Jerome. I just shortened their suffering. Amber D made a bit of profit doing it. That's the American way, isn't it?" The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all 7 counts of murder in the first degree. Patrick McGowan was found guilty on 4 counts, those deaths where evidence proved his direct participation. The sentencing hearing on October 3, 1903, was equally swift. Judge Thomas C. O'Sullivan, himself of Irish descent, showed no mercy. He sentenced Brigid McGowan to death by electrocution, one of the first women in New York to receive such a sentence. Patrick was sentenced to life imprisonment at Sing Sing. Brigid Burrard's execution was set for January 12, 1904, at Auburn Prison, where the state's electric chair for women was located. In the months leading up to her execution, she refused all visits from clergy, claiming they were hypocrites who worshipped wealth as much as she did, but lacked her honesty about it. Her last words, before the current was applied, were reportedly, "I'll see you all in hell soon enough." She was pronounced dead at 11:07 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. She was 43 years old. Patrick McGowan served 32 years at Sing Sing before dying of pneumonia in 1935. He never spoke publicly about his crimes and refused all interview requests. Fellow inmates reported that he spent his final years in near-complete silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Some interpreted this as remorse, others believed he simply had nothing left to say. Broader implications. The case of the Irish widow, as the newspapers dubbed Brigid McGowan, had implications that rippled through American society far beyond the Irish tenements of 5 points. Most immediately, the case revolutionized death certification procedures across the United States. New York's reforms were quickly adopted by other major cities. Massachusetts, Illinois, and Pennsylvania all implemented stricter requirements for death certification by 1905. The concept of the medical examiner system replacing the often corrupt and unqualified coroner system gained momentum from cases like this, though full implementatio would take decades. The scandal also shone an uncomfortable light on how American society treated its most vulnerable citizens. The 7 confirmed victims of Brigid McGowan were all elderly, poor, and socially isolated. They had no family support systems, no savings, no safety nets. They were exactly the kind of people who, in 1903 America, could disappear without anyone in power really noticing or caring. Kathleen Cassidy, who had been instrumental in pushing for investigation of her sister's death, became an activist for elderly immigrants' rights. She worked with progressive reformers to establish some of the city's first legitimate nursing homes and boarding houses with oversight and inspection requirements. "My sister died so that others might be protected," she wrote in a 1910 pamphlet advocating for elderly care reform. "Nora's suffering will not be meaningless if we act." The case also raised disturbing questions about the use of chloral hydrate and other sedatives. In the early 1900s, these drugs were widely available and loosely regulated. Brigid had purchased her supplies from multiple pharmacies without arousing suspicion, claiming they were for her own insomnia. The Food and Drug Administration, created in 1906, would eventually regulate such substances, but in 1903, anyone could buy potentially lethal drugs with minimal oversight. Perhaps most disturbing were the copycat cases that emerged in the investigation's aftermath. Detective Murphy's files revealed at least 3 other suspicious clusters of deaths in rooming houses across Manhattan shared similar patterns. None were as extensive or as well documented as Brigid's crimes, but they suggested that the practice of hastening elderly boarders' deaths to inherit their meager estates might have been more common than anyone wanted to admit. One case in particular stood out. In Brooklyn, a woman named Sarah Weber was arrested in 1904 after the body of an elderly male boarder was exhumed showing signs consistent with chloral hydrate poisoning and evidence of premature burial. During her interrogation, Weber admitted she had heard about the Irish widow's method and decided to try it herself. She was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years. The phenomenon spoke to a dark truth about turn-of-the-century America. The lives of the elderly poor were considered disposable by Number Y in society. They were seen as burdens, not as human beings deserving of care and dignity. Brigid McGowan had simply taken this attitude to its logical, horrific conclusion. If society didn't value these people, why shouldn't she profit from their deaths? The Catholic Church, already defensive about its Irish immigrant flock's reputation, struggled with how to address the case. Some priests preached sermons condemning Brigid as an aberration, a soul lost to greed and evil. Others, more honestly, used the case to examine the Church's failure to adequately support its most vulnerable members. Why had these elderly immigrants ended up in a boarding house with a stranger instead of being cared for by their community? Father O'Malley, the priest who had discovered Anna Sullivan's near burial, left the priesthood in 1905. In a letter to his bishop, he wrote, "I praise that woman from the pulpit, I held her up as a model of Christian charity while she was murdering the very people I had entrusted to her care. I cannot reconcile my faith with my failure. I cannot serve God when I so thoroughly failed his children." He spent the rest of his life working at settlement houses, serving the Puba without the authority or structure of the Church. He died in 1928, having never fully forgiven himself for his role in the tragedy. The psychological aspects of Brigid's crimes fascinated early criminologists and physicians interested in the emerging field of psychiatry. Dr. Bernard Sachs, a prominent New York neurologist, wrote a paper in 1905 analyzing the case from what would now be called a psychopathological perspective. He suggested that Brigid might have suffered from what we would now recognize as antisocial personality disorder, a complete lack of empathy combined with exceptional ability to manipulate others' perceptions. She appeared to be a caring, pious woman, Dr. Sachs wrote. She performed the rituals of compassion perfectly, but there was nothing behind the performance. She felt nothing for these people except calculations of their monetary value. This is not insanity as the law recognizes it. This is something potentially more terrifying evil that understands itself perfectly and chooses its path with full awareness. The question of whether Patrick McGowan was equally culpable or primarily a victim of his mother's manipulation remained debated for years. Some argued that he had been raised by a monster and knew no other way. Others pointed out that he was a grown man who had multiple opportunities to expose his mother and chose profit over justice every single time. The broader social implications extended to how American society viewed Irish immigrants. The case reinforced negative stereotypes about the Irish being prone to alcohol abuse, poverty, and crime. Nativist politicians used Brigid McGowan as an example of why immigration should be restricted. This was particularly painful for the Irish community, which had been working for decades to overcome such prejudices. Yet some Irish-American leaders used the case to advocate for better social services and integration support. They argued that people like Brigid's victims, isolated immigrants with no support systems, were vulnerable precisely because American society had failed to help them assimilate and thrive. If better social services had existed, perhaps these elderly immigrants wouldn't have been so desperate and isolated that they fell into a predator's trap. The case also exposed the inadequacy of New York's mental health and poverty support systems. The city in 1903 had virtually no safety net for elderly poor people. The almshouses that did exist were notorious hellholes that many people preferred death to entering. This created a market for private boarding houses, which, paraded with zero oversight or regulation. Brigid McGowan had thrived in this regulatory vacuum. By 1910, New York had implemented the first boarding house inspection system, requiring licenses and periodic health and safety checks. Other cities followed suit. While these reforms didn't eliminate abuse, exploitation of vulnerable elderly people remains a problem to this day. They did create at least minimal standards and accountability. The forensic aspects of the case also advanced the young field of medical jurisprudence. The exhumations and examinations conducted by Dr. Schultze and his team provided some of the earliest documented evidence of how to distinguish between natural death and datable age by certain poisons. The scratch marks inside coffins, the positioning of bodies, the analysis of tissue for chloral hydrate. All of these became part of the growing body of forensic knowledge. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the case was its impact on burial practices. The sheer terror being buried alive, a fear that had haunted humanity for centuries, suddenly seemed horrifyingly real and recent. Newspapers published sensational accounts of the coffin exhumations, describing in lurid detail the evidence of the victims' final struggles. This sparked what historians call the safety coffin bar movement in America. Inventors patented dozens of devices designed to allow someone mistakenly buried alive to signal for help or escape. These ranged from simple breathing tubes to elaborate systems with bells, flags, and even telephone connections to the cemetery caretaker's office. While most these inventions were impractical, they reflected genuine public anxiety sparked by cases like Brigid McGowan's. The medical community responded by developing more rigorous standards for determining death. The concept of waiting periods before burial became more common, and the practice of embalming, which would make revival impossible, became increasingly standard, partly as assurance against premature burial. The psychological trauma experienced by Anna Sullivan, the sole survivor, was documented by physicians but poorly understood. Today we would recognize her symptoms as severe PTSD. In 1903 they simply noted that she suffered from nervous hysteria and melancholia. Anna lived until 1919, dying at age 87, but according to those who knew her, she never fully recovered from her ordeal. She slept with a bell beside her bed until the day she died, a bell she could ring if she felt herself disappearing again, as she described the paralytic sensation. The case raised uncomfortable questions about euthanasia and mercy killing that American society wasn't ready to address. Brigid's defense had briefly attempted to argue that she was providing mercy to suffering people, an argument the prosecution and court rejected entirely. But in the margins of newspaper coverage, a few voices asked what should be done for elderly people suffering from painful terminal conditions in an era before modern pain management. These questions wouldn't be seriously debated in American medicine and law for another several decades, but the seeds were planted by the McGowan case. The difference, of course, was that Brigid's victims weren't suffering from terminal conditions. They were simply poor and vulnerable, and she had created their suffering through poison to justify their moberados. 5 Points itself began to change in the years following the scandal. Already in decline as an infamous slum, the neighborhood's reputation was further damaged by association with the Irish widow. Progressive reformers used the case as ammunition in their campaigns to demolish the old tenemeba NTS and replace them with theoretically better housing. By the 1920s, much of 5 Points had been razed, though whether the replacements were actually better for the poor people who lived there remains debatable. The story also became part of New York folklore, told and retold with increasing embellishment. By the 1920s, people claimed Brigid had killed as many as 20 people. The confirmed number was 7, possibly 9. They said she practiced black magic and could induce death with a glance. They said her ghost haunted Calvary Cemetery, searching for the souls she'd sent there premature. None of this was true, but it reflected how the case had captured the public imagination. For the victims' families who survived people like Kathleen Cassidy, the broader implications mattered less than the personal tragedy. Kathleen spent years trying to have her sister's grave properly marked and maintained. She wrote letters to newspapers correcting misinformation about Nora, insisting that her sister be remembered as a real person, not just a victim in a sensational crime story. "My sister loved music," Kathleen wrote in 1910. "She could play the fiddle beautifully. She loved children and wanted to be a teacher. She had dreams and hopes and a whole life ahead of her. She was not just victim 4, she was Nora Cassidy, and she mattered." This humanizing effort, the insistence that victims be remembered as people, not statistics, would become increasingly important in American criminal justice, though it would take decades to be fully recognized. Kathleen's advocacy was ahead of its time. The case also influenced literature and popular culture. Several novels and plays in the early 1900s featured villains clearly inspired by Brigid McGowan. Edgar Allan Poe's story The Premature Burial, written decades earlier, suddenly seemed prescient and terrifyingly relevant. The case proved that the horror of being buried alive wasn't just Gothic fiction. It had happened repeatedly in modern New York City. For criminologists and law enforcement, the McGowan case became a teach-and-bejee example of how serial killers, though that term wouldn't be coined until much later, could hide in plain sight by victimizing society's most invisible members. The victims were nobody was watching closely, people whose deaths wouldn't necessarily raise suspicion. This pattern would be recognizable in many later serial murder cases. Detective Sergeant Murphy, who had led the investigation, spent the rest of his career advocating for better protection of vulnerable populations. He pushed for the creation of what would eventually become Adult Protective Services, though that system wouldn't be fully realized until the 1960s. He retired in 1925, having risen to the rank of inspector, and was remembered at his funeral in 1932 as the man who caught the Irish widow and changed how we protect our elderly. The case of Brigid McGowan forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we value human life, particularly the lives of those who are elderly, poor, and isolated. In 1903, these victims were essentially invisible until someone took the time to count the bodies. How many others disappeared into unmarked graves with no one to advocate for them? What do you think drove Brigid McGowan to such acts? Was it pure greed or something darker? Could she have genuinely convinced herself that she was providing mercy, or did she know exactly what she was doing and simply not care? And what about Patrick? Was he a victim of his mother's manipulation, or was he equally monstrous? Leave your theories in the comments. This case raises questions that don't have easy answers, questions about morality, justice, and the value we place on human life. If you found this deep dive into one of New York's darkest chapters compelling, make sure you're subscribed to The Silent Abbey. Ring T-bar at notification bell so you never miss our explorations of history's forgotten horrors. We have more lost stories waiting to be told, stories that remind us that the real monsters aren't always the ones in fairy tales. Thank you for joining me in uncovering the truth about the Irish widow and the Berber D that sang at her funeral a woman's desperate song from inside her own coffin, a sound that finally exposed a pattern of death that had been hiding in plain sight. See you in the next video. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized work of historical fiction. While based on actual practices and conceber RNs from the early 1900s regarding premature burial, chloral hydrate abuse, and the vulnerable position of elderly immigrants, the specific character of Brigid McGowan and the detailed events described are fictional creations meant to illustrate the social conditions and fears of the era. Any resemblance to actual persons or specific events is coincidental.